Well, are you ready to open up the Bible? It's Genesis chapter 32. We've been going through a whole series in Genesis, and I've made my way all the way to 32. We've got a little bit to go, but there's some interesting stories in Genesis. I love it. It's the beginnings. All the foundations are laid in Genesis. And you get to chapter 32, it's Jacob. Remember, you've got Abraham. It starts with Abraham in chapter 12, and then he has a son, Isaac, and Isaac has a son named Jacob, as Jacob and Esau. But Jacob is the favored one. And so Jacob is the subject of this story. And Jacob will become the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. So he has 12 sons. That's Jacob. Even God's going to change his name in this chapter to Israel, right? So let me read it. Got to put my grandpa glasses on since I've advanced these last 2 years. Here we go. Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. So he's being protected by angels as he's going back into the promised land. He's been away for 20 years. We'll talk about that. And Jacob saw them, and he said, "This is God's camp." So he called the name of the place Mahanaim. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now, and I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, female servants, and I have sent to tell my Lord in order that I might find favor in your sight." He's been estranged and an enemy of Esau for a while. And the messengers returned to Jacob saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him." Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He divided his people who were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two camps, thinking, "If Esau comes to one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape." And Jacob said, "O God of my father Abraham and the God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, 'Return to this country and to your kindred, that I may be good to you,' I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I have crossed the Jordan, and now I have two camps. God's blessed me. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude." So he stayed there that night. From what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels. I didn't know they got milk from camels. Anyone have camel milk? Drink camel milk? There was one person in my congregation that had drunk camel's milk. And their calves, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, and 10 male donkeys. These he handed over to his servants, every drove by itself. He said to his servants, "Pass on ahead of me, put a space between drove and drove." And he instructed the first, "When Esau, my brother, meets you and asks you, 'To whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you?' You shall say, 'They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau, and moreover, he is behind us.' He likewise instructed the second and the third and all who followed the droves. You shall say the same things to Esau when you find him, and you shall say, 'Moreover, your servant is behind us.' For he thought, I may appease him with the presents that go ahead of me, and afterward I shall see him face to face. Perhaps he will accept me." So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself stayed that night in the camp. Now, this is the section I really want to camp out on. The same night, he arose and took his 2 wives, 2 female servants, and his 11 children, crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had, and Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why do you ask me my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "I have seen God face to face." That's what Peniel means, face to face. "And yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. I find that last verse a bit humorous, don't you? I mean, Israel and the Israelites would not eat that sinew of the animal, of that hip socket of any animal, because Jacob's hip was put out of joint by God. I'm thinking, well, is it because it was dark meat and not light meat, because I like light meat? Or is it just too tough? No, they didn't eat it because Jacob's hip was touched by God. It was a way to remember a turning point in Jacob's life. You just think about it. Israel did not memorialize, a staircase to heaven, because he had that dream. Remember Jacob's ladder? They didn't memorialize that. They memorialized this moment, and they didn't eat that piece of meat in the hip socket of any animal just because of it. Now, it wasn't like a command like you should keep the Sabbath and keep it holy. It wasn't like that. But it was customary to avoid that piece of meat. It was a turning point in Jacob's life after being away for 20 years. Jacob's name means trickster, deceiver, a cunning one. And his identity would change as he's going back, after 20 years, back into the promised land. That's how significant this moment is. Now, you think about your own life. Do you remember the significant moments in your life? If you're a Christian, moments where God changed you and pressed you deeper with him. Because I do. I remember when I went from becoming a religious person to a Christ follower, and there was a marked difference. I went to church all my life. But it wasn't until I was 17 years old when I truly became a Christ follower. And when I surrendered to the area of vocational ministry, it was, I'm going to be on the mission field. I'm ready to die on some obscure island. And I remember praying through that moment up in my room. And I remember willing to be a pastor, to write sermons every week. And I don't like, story problems or any kind of essays. I like multiple choice because I do pretty good. Writing essays or anything like that, I did not want to be. Now I do it every week. When I had to be willing to be a worship pastor, when I wanted to be the senior pastor. When I wanted to be a senior pastor in the West Coast, where we grew up, Betsy and I, Washington and California, when God wanted me out in the Midwest. It's cold up there, It was 2 degrees when we left. So this is really balmy weather. I mean, come on. But these were moments in my life where my hip, in a sense, was knocked out of joint. These were painful moments that God brought me to a place to take me deeper than I had ever known. Moments when I thought I was losing, but I ended up gaining more of Christ. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because you have moments like that too, right? Where you thought you lost everything, and it was just the beginning of what God wanted to do in your life. I remember, well, here's my prayer. My prayer today is that there'll be some hip-wrenching moments today for you. That's what I want. I remember reading, one of my favorite biographies was a biography of Martin Lloyd Jones, who was a 20th century preacher in London. He's passed away since then. But, preachers read about preachers. So I was reading about a preacher. And I remember Dr. Jones talking. He was listening to a group of preachers talk about a young, vibrant preacher that was coming up the ranks. And everyone admired him, but one of the more seasoned preachers waited to the very end to talk. He stayed quiet for a while, and then he spoke. He says, he's a good preacher, but he hasn't developed a limp yet. I want to hear him after he's suffered a bit. And he says that because it's often the case that our faith becomes more vivid, more deeper, more alive when we have suffered. When we have been forced to sacrifice our dreams on the altar. When Mount Moriah, Abraham sacrificing his son on Mount Moriah, when Mount Moriah becomes a familiar scene to us, it's like we're trekking back up the mountain to put back on the altar something that's precious to us. Christ becomes more dear, more satisfying in that moment. And Jacob has been restless his entire life, wanting the blessing, wanting the affirmation, starting with his family, okay? That's my first point, family. Pretty easy to write down. I got 3 points. Family, employment, God. All right? Let's go with family first. I'll give you a summary of what has happened up to this point. Rebekah, his mom, she's in the promised land, but she waited 20 years before she had one child. That's a long time to wait. There was a lot of ache in her heart. But when she became pregnant, before knowing that there was 2 in her womb, she entreated the Lord, like, what's going on, man? This seems so unique. I think all first-time moms think their pregnancy is unique, but she was correct. She had 2 in her womb. And here's what the Lord said about those 2. Chapter 25, verse 23. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Esau and Jacob. Esau came first. Even though they're twins, Esau came first. And we know, biblically speaking, firstborn meant something. It meant that you got the lion's share of the inheritance just for coming first. And Isaac, the father, would have known that prophecy, had to know that prophecy. Because you don't wait 20 years and then you find out there's 2 in the womb and you don't know the prophecy. Rebekah wouldn't have told him. Oh yeah, had to have told him. And yet, even though knowing that God would favor the younger, Isaac ignored it and tried to overrule the prophecy because of his affection. His affection toward his son ran naturally toward Esau over Jacob. Now, you can understand why, because Esau liked outdoors. He liked hunting. He liked grilling meat. I mean, what's not to like about that? Jacob stayed indoors with his mom and would rather cook than hunt. And as Jacob grew up, he moved further and further and further apart from Dad. So I'm sure he heard Dad all the time praise Esau in his presence. And that pain would have grown in his heart. You think if you were a Lord of the Rings fan, it would be like Boromir over Faramir. And you know the pain that was caused in that story in Faramir's heart. It's painful. It's like a son taken to the arts when Dad is all things sports. And he's envisioning playing catch with his son and cheering on the sidelines in the high school. You know, a boy can easily guess he's a disappointment to his father. And the father doesn't even need to say anything. He just needs to simply neglect and be disinterested. And it will cut like a knife. And that's where Jacob is. But in a shrewd business deal, here's Jacob. He got Esau to trade away his firstborn status and his inheritance. It's now Jacob's. But wealth is nothing compared to his father's approval and love. It means a lot to him. And though Jacob was close to his mother, he craved his father's blessing more than anything. So when it came time for the ceremonial blessing at the end of Isaac's life, it would drive Jacob to dress up like his brother Esau just to hear those words of blessing over him. Because you have to know, the roost is going to be up. They're going to know it was Jacob because Esau comes in like, oh no, who did I bless? He would have known. Jacob would have known his foolery would have been discovered, but just to hear those words of his father, even though he had to dress up to get him. Blessings were verbal affirmations. You know, in the Old Testament, yes, blessings, there could be wealth a part of blessing. There's other blessings that would come, but this particular word meant verbal, a verbal word of blessing. It's like, you're important to me. I enjoy being around you. I am proud of what you're becoming. You're my favorite. I mean, I don't know if you want to say your favorite, but for a father to say that of his children is really important. Even mothers to children, for sure. To hear that from their parents is huge. And there are men who are craving to hear the affirmation of fathers. And Jacob is one of them. Esau received all of that when Jacob was in the home. Just once, Jacob wanted to hear it. I'm not going to leave you until you bless me. As if he said that to his father. He's going to say it to God. You know, we all need someone besides ourselves to tell us that we matter, that we're appreciated, that we're loved. That's why we work so hard. That's why we climb so many ladders. It's so that someone might say, you're important to this company. We couldn't do it without you. We appreciate what you've done. And in the family, we need to hear that from mom and dad. We need to hear that from our siblings. So that's family. Let's go to employment. Point number 2. Jacob had to leave in a hurry because, again, he tricked his dad. His mom was in on it. The relationships were raw. They were all at each other's throats because of Jacob. His self-centered craving for importance was a wrecking ball in the family. Because our issues never stay private. You know, whatever you are wrestling with on the inside, in your soul, if you don't take it to the Lord, if you don't deal with it with you and the Lord, it will affect the relationships right around you. And they can even go to work. Your issues can go to work too. Because when there is a deficit in our souls, work success can be a way to compensate, a way to prove everybody wrong about us. We prove everyone wrong about you, that we are indispensable, that we deserve the salary, we deserve even a better salary, we're important. We want to prove it all, right? And we'll hold on to our work until we get the blessing from them, a verbal affirmation. And Jacob came, if he wanted an affirmation, he came to the wrong job site. Because his uncle Laban was a piece of work. He was difficult. Laban tricked him out of marrying Rachel. That's when he actually had to marry Leah as well, so he has 2 wives. That's another sermon. I can't get into that. He also changes his salary 10 times. How would you like your employer to do that? Just manipulated and tried to extract everything out of Jacob so that Laban would get rich. And he would have taken even everything away from Jacob if the Lord hadn't warned Laban not to do it. But my guess is that Jacob stayed 20 years and an extra 6 years because I think he probably wanted to prove himself worthy of Laban's good opinion. I think it's funny how how much we need affirmation of people that we don't even respect and we don't even want to be around. Jacob is coming back now to the promised land after so many years, wealthy, humbled, and yet still craving that affirmation. And you can be successful at your job and still leave dissatisfied. You can be lucrative in your job and be dissatisfied because there's certain things that you crave and want. And it puts us at a deficit. However, Jacob's faith has grown. He is learning how to trust the Lord. His first stop in entering the promised land was to reconcile with his brother Esau, whom he cheated. That's 20 years ago. That says something about it, because I think some of us would, if we've done harm to someone, we would rather just kind of skate in and avoid it altogether. Maybe they forgot about it. Trust me, they didn't. It's always better when you reconcile and you're the one that says, I was wrong when I did, and be specific. No generalities like, no, I don't know. Tell me exactly what you did wrong. I was wrong when I did this. Will you forgive me? That's a good thing to do and to practice in your home on a regular basis. But he didn't do that. But Jacob is coming back. So he's learning to trust the Lord, to reconcile with his brother, and a delegation is sent ahead of him to find Esau in Edom. In verse 4 and 5, he tells this delegation, Jacob does, say to my Lord, his brother Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants and female servants. I have sent to tell my Lord in order that I might find favor in your sight. Now, if Jacob is still the same brother, he would have avoided, let me say that again. If Jacob was still the same brother, he would have avoided Esau altogether. But he is different. He is starting to trust the Lord on a deeper level. But he didn't do a very good job communicating his intentions. Because here's how it came across, I'm sure. He honors Esau by calling him Lord, but fails to say anything that resembles repentance. I was wrong when I cheated you. Will you forgive me? That would have been beautiful. He says something about his wealth, but that could have come across as bragging to Esau. I got all these donkeys and all these things. It could have been bragging after 20 years, because both boys want to appear successful after being away from each other for 20 years. And now they're coming together, kind of like a high school reunion. They want to flex a little bit, show they're kind of successful. Life's been good. And so Esau didn't make mom and dad very happy with his marriage decisions, and Jacob blew up the family with his deceit. But here they're coming to meet up, and Jacob sends a delegation to tell Esau how successful he's been, and what does Esau do? He comes with 400 men, like he's coming to war. He's showing off his power. It's to show that he's not the loser. Now, why do I say that Jacob's faith has grown? Because in his fear, look at verse 9 through 12, he prays to God. He's praying to God. And he says, because he's fearful. He is super fearful. He goes to God and he recounts in his prayer the promises that God has made to him. Let me tell you, when you're in fear, that happens all the time, anxieties rise, you need to go to God and say, God, but you have said. So you stand upon firm foundation, not your emotions that go all over the place. That will not do you any good. Stand on the promises that God has made to you and me. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous. I will go with you wherever it is. You get it and you put it right in front of you as you're praying, because you got to remember it. Because whatever is in front of you that you're afraid of looms large. You got to get Lord's promises out in front, and that's what he does. In verse 9, you said to return to the promised land so that you may do good to me. I fear Esau will harm my family, but you said you'd do good for me and multiply my family. See what he's doing? So Jacob, he probably should have stayed in prayer a little longer, because then he gets a little crafty. He gathers a generous gift, and then he sends it in waves. Could be wise, I don't know. Try to soften his brother's heart. He puts a wave of gifts. And he says, this is from Jacob. Next wave. This is from Jacob. And guess where Jacob is? He's in the back. Tough guy, huh? Sends his wives and his children. Tough guy. Jacob sends all his wives and children across the river to be left alone. And here's Jacob. He's been scheming all his life to get a blessing from his family, scheming all his life to get a blessing from his employment. But he finds in the end his greatest need, the need that drove him to cheat his family and to work himself to the bone, has always been to hear the Lord himself say words of affirmation over him. That's what he really needs. Let's go to that last point, God. Because here's the wrestling match. He's all by himself. He sees these angels across. I don't know what he thinks about the angels. Maybe, they're protecting. Maybe he thinks it's an intruder. I don't know if he knows who this person is right away. He just goes over there and they end up wrestling. They end up wrestling all night long. I think you'd get tired. It's an unusual wrestling match, and Jacob has seen angels watching over the journey. But in this all-night wrestling match, it seems like an equal match until we find out that the other guy has been holding back. Because all he does is touch his hip, and it goes out of joint. And even when Jacob is clearly beaten, he says to God, because he's going to find out as God, I will not let you go until you bless me. I love that. I pray that that kind of passion, that kind of desire is in this group to an increasing degree. I will not let you go until you bless me. That's the satisfaction that makes us strong, not in work accomplishments or whatever your family says of you. It's what God says of you. More of God will let you stand strong. And the encounter is completely transforming for him because Jacob's been wrestling, manipulating situations his whole life just to be blessed. And now he's wrestling with God, who injures him, changes his name, and ends up blessing him. Remember, Jacob, the word Jacob means trickster, someone who's excelled by deceit, manipulation, but now his name is going to be Israel. That's where the whole nation gets its name, from this guy, Israel. And it means wrestler with God. That's awesome. Someone who contends with God and prevails. God allowed him to prevail. And in response, he goes, well, what is your name? And the angel of the Lord, or the Lord himself, would not give it to him, which is kind of interesting. Jacob's not told, but he comes to only one conclusion in the end. I've seen God face to face, and I'm still alive. The reason why he says that, because God's glory is so tremendous and terrifying that it says in the Old Testament that no one sees God face to face and lives. So Jacob knows that, but he is saying, I've seen him face to face, and yet I live. And that's what the word Peniel means. I've seen him face to face. And verse 29, you would miss it if you were reading it on your own. It's so easy to overlook. It says, there he blesses him. There he blesses him. And we're not even told what was said, because blessings were always verbal. He said something to Jacob that really was important to Jacob, but I guess it was between he and Jacob. But he blessed him. And Jacob, verse 31, the next day, was limping. And my guess, though I can't know for sure, but my guess is that Jacob literally limped the rest of his life, which led people to ask what happened, which then said, oh, we're probably not going to eat that piece of meat then, and all the animals, because it's holy to the Lord. It just kind of spread that way. It was so transformative that all the descendants, until Moses wrote it down, because he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, they were still doing this. Tim Keller, pastor in Manhattan, or was, in talking about this episode in Jacob's life, says that weakness, pain, injury, in Jacob's case, is the way that God draws near to us, is the way that he blesses us. Sinclair Ferguson, in talking about the same episode, said that God often, listen to this, God often dislocates whatever makes us strong in order that we may experience Christ's strength. Now, does that sound like utter nonsense? Because if you're outside of Christianity or you haven't read the Bible, that sounds like utter nonsense. How is it that we get blessed when we get injured or when we suffer? How in the world? Well, it's not really nonsense if you think of the cross of Christ, because Paul looked at the cross and said, the power of God, the wisdom of God. Well, you got a guy hanging on a cross. That's the most shaming place to be. How could it be power? How could it be wisdom? But he says in 1 Corinthians 1:23, Paul says, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews, folly, a joke to the Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because suffering Jesus doesn't look like power to the natural mind. If we want to share in power, we go to the people who are influential so that they can lift us up a little bit in status, right? But if you read the Bible, true power is climbing down, getting vulnerable, weak, confessing sin, because we all have it, looking to Christ for help. And it feels like dying. It feels like you're giving everything away, and probably success will never come back to you. It will feel like dying. But when you die, you experience power. When you die like that, when you confess your sin, you are, in a sense, dying with Christ, and then you will also experience the power of the resurrection. New life. Death first, though, then life. That's the way it is in the Bible. Because guess what? We rely upon ourselves. We will not look to anybody outside of ourselves until we're down on the ground. That's how you come into the kingdom of God. You have to get low before God raises you up. You have to understand that your sin is offensive to a holy God, and that you have broken his law, and you will answer to him. All of us answer to him. He gives your life breath. And when you come to that moment, you go low in humility and brokenness. You die to all your dreams. You die to all your sinful life, and you turn around. That's repentance. You turn and face him and say, whatever you want, Lord. You call the shots. I'll do whatever you want. In that moment, you are rebuilt. You go from death to life, resurrection life. And the Holy Spirit gets put in you to make new desires that you never had before you became Christian. Never. I remember the day I finally started to like reading the Bible. And I grew up in the church. But when I, at 17, became a Christian, all the desires started to come to me. Like, I really want to please the Lord. I want to live for him, not myself. Because living for myself, it's a dead-end road. Tim Keller presses the point further for the Christian. The cross is not just atonement, but the way that God works in everyone he loves. Pain, suffering, death to our dreams and plans, and manipulations to get ahead so that he can change us, so he can bless us. You want to be blessed? You got to go up on Mount Moriah and sacrifice the things that you are so fearful to lose. Because he's more. He's way more, and he will never disappoint you. The blessing that we crave doesn't mean that life is without struggle or sorrow. His blessing actually comes through the cross, through pain, through loss, trying for years to hear the blessing from the family, for our work, when the blessing that we crave most of all comes from God. And you will never know that until you limp. Why don't you bow your heads? Lord, in a room like this, I know that you are pressing it down deep. There are people who have been struggling with losing something very precious to them, but it's been hindering their life with you, their fellowship with you, their perspective on life. The thing means too much. It's an idol, and it needs to be let go of. And I pray by the power of your Holy Spirit, it will be let go. And I know that there are people, too, that they're not sure where they are in their relationship with you. I pray that you would continue to drive them to be more miserable until they give up and come to you. To let go of their thimble full of happiness in this life when you want to give them an ocean. Convince them even now, Lord, that the sure place to build a life is upon you. It's on you, and it's always been you.